Well, welcome to Culture Couch Live this week. I've got Emil and Mel. How are you, Emil and Mel? Before I introduce our next,
G'day, Roosie.
Very well.
Hi, Mel.
How are we?
Yeah.
Good.
Very well.
Excellent.
Top of the world.
Top of the world. Beautiful. And now I'm going to introduce Chris Olson, who's our newest member, as our senior performance consultant in North America, in California. So for those of you who don't know, we've started. Emil's doing really well in Toronto. The crew are really kicking goals in Australia, and we've decided to start in California and North America, which is really exciting. So, Chris, welcome to your first Culture Couch.
Yeah, it's an honor. I was waiting for this.
I know you. Yeah, it's very exciting when you get on the Culture Couch Live. We know
no
that.
doubt. Yeah.
No doubt. Now, just a bit of background and for the listeners at home. So, Chris and I met in you got a question you asked, Emil? You got a question? Should you put your hand down?
No, I was clapping. I was doing the clapping emoji.
This is my show. This is not your show. So just back off a bit. You'll get your opportunity in a minute. So Chris and I met back in 1999. So we've got a really long association. So I retired in 98, as everyone, you guys know. Came to America. I got a phone call from a guy called Paul O'Keefe for the United States Australian Football League. And he asked me if I could do some clinics around America, which I had a great time. And Chris was playing for the Inland Empire Eagles. So that was our first meeting, Chris, sort of thing. So probably given our pedigree and our background, even though most of our work's in corporate, is in sport, what the Sydney Swans did. And you've got a pretty good insight. We touched on before we got on that you were actually part of my journey before it even became my journey, in 1999, after I'd written the 25 points and all that sort of stuff. So I guess through your lens as an American playing Australian rules football, watching the evolution of the Swans and then Geelong and then this transformation, take it through that.
Yeah. So it was interesting even back then, right? I think the first day we went out and had a kick and you were doing interviews as we were driving around, right? And you had your notebook and everything. And it was interesting to see that journey and where you were going and how it was tying together. And I think some of the early days, it's cool. I can say that I was one of your first assistant coaches in your first coaching role with the Revolution. And glad we got the win on the day. Although I remember you crossing the field at one point to get some coaching in on the Canadian side, just in case things didn't turn out the way we expected. But it was interesting to watch that happen because I ended up playing with the Revos and getting to see the things that you talked about then, early days. Yeah. And as you were put into that interim coaching role and how that got implemented, I think the Swans went 6-10 or something at that point. And there was some momentum. It was interesting too, because I was down in Melbourne with the Revolution at that time for the International Cup and having coffee with you in St. Kilda. And all of a sudden there's this celebrity element to this because, Paul Roos sitting in the middle of a coffee shop in St. Kilda would get some people's attention. But just seeing how that whole thing evolved and how the Swans were going about it. And then that you'd come up with this plan to be able to have sat back and watched all this happen. And then to see it evolve the way that it did. And that not only you could have written a story and a book and a movie around 2005, but to see that in 2022 that the Bloods culture is still, I think on my my Twitter account, the Swans posted today the Bloods culture, it's still alive and well. And I think if anything, it's the longevity that speaks to the strength of everything that you've done there. So it's been definitely been a journey.
And Emil, you talk a lot about storytelling. I guess it's always exciting. Mel came on during the year. It's always exciting when we have a new person come on, but the stories that Chris has got to tell makes it compelling for us. And I introduced you to Chris about 12 months ago. So tell us a bit about that from your point of view, again, connecting, like Chris and I have known each other for over 20 years. You met Chris, but the story that Chris has got to tell becomes really important in the workshops, doesn't it? Because of his connection to Performance by Design, the connection to me, the connection to the Swans, the understanding of the journey that we've had over the last 20 odd years.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Chris, when you were up here doing some training, I think you told me a story that when you first met Ruzi, that piece of paper, I think it had like 8 or 9 points on it. Like it was that fresh, which I think is really cool and shares to the lens of, you almost saw the first chapter of the book and then you got to watch the next. So that's really cool and insight. And I love that you played footy. In fact, Ruzi, I don't think we shared this with you yet, but Chris and I realized we played a game against each other because I've been big involved with Canadian football, Aussie Bulls football here in Canada. Yeah. So I played in an Aussie versus Aussie game. Where was it? In Pittsburgh, Chris?
Pittsburgh, yeah.
Yeah. So we've actually played, and I think also in Arizona we had a kick against each other in
that's right.
Cyclone.
Yeah.
So we actually realized that our history goes back a fair way as well. But I think we're not only does the sport connection and that example of our work, but now that Chris has come up and done some training and seen what our process looks like in action with some quite developed teams that have been with us for a while and are going through the cycle of the systems. And then, of course, Chris's background in car dealerships and making the connection and the stories between the cultures that you've grown up in professionally to observe the swans and you use the longevity, the sustainability. When you get the core right, it doesn't go away. It actually only gets stronger, which is really cool, right? As long as you keep driving the system. So yes, Chris's background is just perfect. It's a perfect foundation for working with us at Performance by Design for sure.
And Chris, tell us what did you tell us a bit about, because before I bring Mel into the conversation, car business was probably similar to footy a bit. Like it was a real top down, and I remember I tell the story, and this was no disrespect to Wolsey and Parkin, and we just didn't have a lot of time. So probably 2 questions within one. Yeah, that sort of top down environment you've been in, and then what did you learn? What were the things that really stuck out for you when you spent that couple of days with Emil, connecting the dots with your great experience, your knowledge of what you've done, and now coming on board Performance by Design?
Yeah, I think there's 2 pieces that I want to, examples that are coming to mind, right? From my consulting side and working with dealers. And I remember a scenario where I was sitting down with a general manager who runs 2 stores in Las Vegas. And he had a guy that was they were looking at promoting him to a similar position at another dealership. And this guy was doing everything in his power to keep this guy down, not to push him up, right? Yeah. And so it's this weird mentality that in an organization that you'd even allow that mindset to trickle in, because all he was thinking about was how it would affect him. He'd lose one of his best guys. I think the right mentality is that I want to bring people in because I'm going to be building you up to send you up. It's that Bill Walsh mentality, right? And that's what I thought was always so impressive with what you'd done at the Swans in having this situation where, John Longmire comes in and takes the reins, and then a couple of years later is playing in the grand final and then does it again. And that's really stood out for me. And I think that's where in the States we have a very, we're not looking at it the right way. We're looking at how it affects us, not generally looking at a bigger picture
mentality rather than the team mentality.
Yeah. And I think that's where, I think what's happening in the car business is a microcosm for corporate, because I've spent a lot of time in the corporate environment as well. And you see the same things, right? And so I think what I really picked up with Emil watching the sessions, and we had, one was a utility, one was a kind of mid-size company. Working with the utility was very interesting. There was a scenario in one of the workshops where there was, you're talking about engineers, right? And you're talking about guys that aren't necessarily going to talk about vulnerability or, doing shout outs or catching the good. Like none of these guys care about any of that. These are hard men doing hard work, right? This is, he's facilitating a conversation with these guys. And one of the guys in front of his boss and his boss's boss says, you know what? I don't give a crap about any of this stuff. And he actually used even more colorful language. Yeah. I just care that the check shows up on Fridays and I can feed my family. Right. even when you saw his breakout session, the guys in his group were trying to get away from it. They didn't want to be around that negative energy, you know? But what was really powerful though, by the end of that session, the group had come in around him, and then he was leaning into it, and he was an active participant in the conversation. And I just thought, man, if you can do that here with this guy, we can do this anywhere, right? So yeah, so that was probably one of my biggest takeaways, in being able to see that actually working, because I've wondered about that,
We had
right?
to hold the line, didn't we? Yeah.
Yeah, well, and it was almost like the people did, because they saw the value in it, that they wanted to bring him along, and he realized real quick that he would be further ostracized if he didn't participate. And
but I also think to Mel at the point is most people want a system. Most people want some guidance, and that's probably the thing coming out of sport, where it's so systematic, you know. And often we talk a bit about the troublemakers at not only footy clubs but work as well. But my experience is, Mel, and most of the time people want to be part of something, but if there's no system in place, it's really hard to bring them in, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, Rosie. I think it's an interesting thing, because I think Chris and I have some parallels in our heritage, in the sense that we've come from vocations that are, you know, obviously economically driven and corporate in some ways. And in that setting, it is really easy to lose sight of the other elements that actually make you a high-performing team. So absolutely, you do have those core elements of strategy and economics and all of those things that are the day-to-day technical things, but it's the stuff around it actually that lift a team. So, you know, we talk about it a lot. There's the technical competencies, and then there's the character and the care piece. And no matter whether it's, you know, in an auto setting like in Chris's background, or in media, which is my background, so these things really can be blind spots, but they're differentiators for businesses. You know, I think Chris has seen that. I think when we was talking earlier, and you were describing the fact that, in a very male-dominated auto world, and the thing that stood out to me is, even in the sporting world, that example that you said of somebody grabbing the what do you call it, the face mask. That is very visual to me. But when you articulated that, I feel like I've experienced that in my career, and I wasn't wearing face masks, you know. So it's interesting that those things absolutely exist, but without the awareness, whether it's a third party, but another set of eyes to come in, just like that example that you've shown, and show that there is another way, is critical. And I think that's what you've seen too, Chris, in your journey, that there is another way, which is very much what we do.
I think that's probably, Chris, and I'll jump in, but I'll ask you, but I think that's probably a little bit where Chris's frustration, and I remember Chris and I spoke a lot on the back of that, Mel. It's a really good point, on the back of them, and that came back to my manifesto in 98. Like, there's got to be a better way. And this was never any disrespect to anyone before me, but it was more around Chris. And you and I have had, you know, we've known each other for 20 odd years. We've had a lot of conversations where we've just connected and we've picked up the phone and you've asked me a question. But a lot of that has been brought out of that frustration, hasn't it?
Yeah, because there's this, in a sales environment, and Mel, you I'm sure you can speak to this, right? Is there's a level of, in order to find success, there has to be accountability. Your top 20, you know, there's the 80-20 rule, right? Your top 20 people are producing 80% of your work. You don't need to manage those folks. They know what they're driving it. You know, it's getting that 80% to do the work. And how do you get them to do the work without it feeling like micromanagement? And so what we did in consulting was we would bring them the process and the way it was meant to be done, but we really never empowered them to take ownership of it and to really own it as their organization. It was just, you know, that grab them by the face mask. Hey, why aren't you making your phone calls? You know, why didn't you do that follow-up? And when it becomes more about the behavior and just how we define ourselves as an entity, and I don't want to let my team down, when we can pivot that mentality, that's really why I wanted to make this change and join a team here where you're really doing it. And I mean, it's such an honor for me to be part of this team, because I really think this is what's missing especially here in the States. Like it's just, everything has been, I think it goes everywhere, doesn't it? Because it's funny. It's simple, but it's so impactful and so powerful. Yeah.
We talk about it a lot, don't we, Emil? Like, it's simple. The other thing I think is really important is a lot of it is about that initial workshop, bringing people together. And the number of times, Mel and Emil, we see people a little bit disengaged, and it's like we start what we're doing then, and you can see them, oh, hang on, so we're going to create this culture. I'm going to be part of this. Wow, and I never forget that. There was a real leap of faith at the Swans, and we had this group of guys in the room, and we started talking. I had no idea it was going to work, but I guarantee one of the most important things is their sense of belonging, their sense of we're going to create this collectively. And I would never underestimate that, because regardless of whether you're in sales or footy or whatever it is, most people want to feel part of a team, don't they? And they want to feel, I talk about not being an employee, but being a shareholder. How do I not just punch the clock in and punch it out, but I want to be a shareholder. So, that's part of the system, isn't it?
Yeah, there's two things at play here. There's the psychology of decision making. So if you're part of or make the decision, the chances of taking action are greatly increased, right? Which is why asking questions is such a powerful behavioral impact tool. Let's call it a behavioral impact tool, right? It's the question versus the tell, which is obviously it's a 21st century leadership skill. In fact, it's a 21st century leadership must. So building the code with the team, and Chris, you saw that because we did a tune-up with the group of team members from that org, where we captured a bunch of data from June's session, and we brought it up to them in October, November, and said, hey, here's what we heard from you, and now here's the next draft of the code. And some of them were like, oh, hang on a second, I was part of that. That was really cool. And then the other thing that's in play here, and a big lesson that I've learned a lot the last few months or so, is you don't have to change the person to change their behavior. No. You just have to change their environment.
Yeah.
And so in that conversation before, an example, it was, you hold the line, you do the exercise, the environment changes. Now, we didn't change that individual, but the environment changed their behavior. And that's what you're talking about, Ruzi, when you talk about the system. Yeah. The system will enable people to act their way in or act their way out. And that's, you talk to your 80-20 rule there, Chris. That's how you actually bring the team up, because you build the code together, but then you systematize it so people can make the decision by their actions, basically.
Yeah, 100%. Well, I just want to finish off, and I'll maybe ask you a question, and I'll go to Emil. But what's your advice to Chris? So you've been with us now. What's the most impactful thing you've seen? And we've done a couple of really cool sessions together lately. But from your point of view, set of eyes coming in, what about 8-9 months ago now, sort of thing. So what's the most impactful thing that you've seen with the PBD system?
So there's two things that come to mind. One is something that Jared Murphy said to me, and this is from the outset. Trust the process.
Yeah,
and, great. For me, every time I walk into a session, I have that mentality again, because the truth about it is, it doesn't matter who's in the room, the process works. Right. And at the beginning, I'm a high blue, so I like the structure and I like the certainty and I like things to be right, and and that's not what this process is about. This process actually is about letting people be and having a voice and giving them a sense of value. So for me, given my insights discovery profile and my heritage, my advice would be to trust the process and trust in the power of having people in a room together, because to your point earlier, Ruzi, that's more than half of it. That's our program. Yeah.
100%.
Thanks, Mel.
And it was fascinating, because at the end of the PBD meeting, I shared with Emil, but I didn't share it with anyone else. I was actually going to make a statement. The last month, I've done about 6 keynotes, and they were all really different companies. And it was just it was an eye-opener, Mel, to your point. There was a hospital, there was a TAFE, there was a real estate company, there was, And it really struck me at the end of the month, at the end of November, it was like, it doesn't matter the company. It's a really good. So, Em, I might finish with you. I mean, what from your point of view, just sharing your years of wisdom with Chris, and we're super excited to have him on board. But what would be perhaps one thing that you would say to Chris? Or, mate, what about a young Emil? What if you're talking about a young Emil?
That's how I position that question, actually.
I like that I'm framed as being younger than Emil here.
The trust the process one was a big one. Where my head went initially, and it's what's happening a little bit with Alexandra's training over here as well, is you don't get to a session and nothing's fixed. Like if nothing, there's not a, if you press this button, it multiplies your ad spend and equates to more money in your bank account, right? So there's this element of trusting the process, holding the line, and that's why it's been really enjoyable the last month or so to go back to this big project we're doing here, and it's 4 months after the kickoff, and the language that's being used in these sessions that is very organic, because by the time you get to the tune-ups, we're really in facilitation mode. There's minimal content, and it's just question, exercise, layering question, maybe drop a story, and then let them, let the process do its thing. And so you never leave a workshop with it fixed. It's just, okay, what are we going to improve so that when we come back, in 2 weeks' time, we make a 0.1% improvement, and then essentially let the compound interest of trust develop, and then just back it in. And Chris, we laughed when you were here, and we always laugh about this. When you actually dissect what actually happens, it's just very simple and practical things that get inserted into the way they operate that again compound over time. So believe it, it goes back to trusting the process, really, doesn't it? I just said it in a different way.
Can I add something, Rosie? Just briefly.
Yeah,
I just wanted to add, because for me to distill, a lot of people say, well, what are the outcomes? What will I get out of it? When will I see this? When will I see that? So I also have a heritage in health as a speech pathologist many moons ago. And to some clients, I actually just explained to them, we're not a medication, we're a therapy. So we're not a pill that you put in and it fixes your vomiting.
Great.
It's therapy. And as therapists, you need to do some work yourself, but we'll give you whatever you need to get there. And that's the differentiation for me. And I think that's a way to, you sort of mentioned it too, Em, but that's the way that we work. We're not a pill. We're all about a therapy, and we'll give you the tools.
Yeah, and it goes back to not leaving culture to chance, doesn't it? I mean, for me, we know that's our mission and purpose, but that's what it goes back to. How do we systemize culture? But we're really excited, Chris. And I think, amongst everyone, it's always good to have a new member coming into the team, but it's almost fate. I look at this as fate. You and I met in 99. Like, this is incredible. I met American.
It'll be a movie, mate.
I met this American, inland Emperor Eagles who's trying to tackle with his head and drive his body through the, all this sort of stuff. And now, you follow the journey, and the story in your journey in your corporate world and understanding the sport, having, our American, our boots on the ground now in California, mate, it's really exciting for us. And it really is. We're really excited about Performance by Design entering in the North American market and being a real serious player in that leadership and culture, and having you on board, mate, with your story is super compelling. So welcome to the team, guys.
Beautiful.
Chris, fantastic. Thanks, guys, for Culture Couch.
Well done, team.
All right.
Thanks, guys. Welcome, Chris. Cheers.
Thank you.
All right. We'll see everyone next week on the Culture Couch Live.